Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webcast today and welcome. My name is Kevin Kline, and I'm joined by two of my friends, Jeff Garbus and Peter Stefano, who will introduce themselves in just a moment. But as I always like to do, I want to take a moment and thank you and express gratitude for spending some time with us today. We all recognize that you're busy and you have very active work and life balance issues going on all the time. So thank you for spending some time with us today. This is an information packed session. I mean, it's got so many tips and tricks and useful information. I think you'll really find it useful and valuable to you if you are trying to control costs in AWS, in Azure, or even some of the other cloud providers that we don't specifically mention. So I think it's going to be a good time and well worth your attention. So, Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a database geek. I've been working with databases for over 30 years. On the SQL Server side, I've been working with SQL Server. I was certified to teach performance and tuning on SQL Server back in '89, at which point you actually had to have done it before they'd let you teach it. So I've been working on it that long. Right now, I am CEO of Soaring Eagle Data Solutions. We are a primarily SQL Server, but multi-database platform managed services and a provider. We do performance and tuning, Power BI, all kinds of fun stuff. And thank you, Kevin, for the invite. I love doing these things with you. It's been a blast, and looking forward to this one as well.
Fun note there. I started with SQL Server in the early 90s, and you were one of the few authors out there who had content that I could get a hold of and read. So yeah, I knew of you before you knew of me, but in both cases, decades ago, right?
Well, if you ask me to autograph SQL Server 6 Unleashed, I may laugh at you.
Yeah, right. And Peter, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thank you a lot, Ken. Well, first of all, thank you all for letting me join. I'm sitting here with two database heavyweights. So the big brains are to the left and to the right of me. I've been with Solarwinds a little over 6 years. I'm on the product marketing side, but I've been in tech my whole life. I've been around since raised floors and water-cooled mainframes all the way through where we are today. I love technology. The work I've been doing with Solarwinds now is really focused on our observability offerings, which encompasses database and infrastructure and applications, and whether it's our self-hosted or SaaS offerings. And again, today I'm excited to be part of the conversation and sharing some really interesting information. But the guys you really care about are the ones that are Jeff and Kevin, because these guys are the database wizards.
Well, thank you, and we appreciate you, Pete. Don't think because you don't have a book that you're not special and valuable to us here. That's not the case. So my first book came out in the early 90s. It was an Oracle book, but then my second book was on SQL 6.5. So I was just on your heels there, Jeff. I've written a lot of books over the years. My most famous, which is a bestseller, is SQL in a Nutshell by O'Reilly. And I've also written a book on database migration. So I feel like I'm pretty solid on this technology. I hope you'll follow me on social media, and we'll have our contact information at the end so you can get in touch with all of us. We all respond to emails and love to have conversations with our friends in the community. So hope you'll take advantage of that. So like I said, we have a packed agenda today. We created 5 umbrella categories of ways that you can help control costs in the cloud. However, under each of these categories, we have lots of little discrete tips and tricks and points to make as well. And so the first thing we thought we would do is kick off with a review of what it takes to have a successful cloud migration. Okay. There are certain well-known factors that if you do them properly, you have a much higher probability of success. It doesn't guarantee it, but you have a much higher probability. And conversely, if you skip many of these steps, then you dramatically raise the possibility of having issues and having problems, and maybe experiencing the worst of all worlds, which is to repatriate what you have deployed to the cloud and pulling it back on premises. So, Pete, if you don't mind, why don't you take us through some of the success and failure factors that we've learned over time about cloud migrations for databases?
Yeah, I think that this is good. I'm going to kind of set up the rest of what Kevin talked about. And I'm not sure that what I'm going to share with you should be a surprise to you, but we've got some data here. The first bullet here is 82% of IT pros say executive leadership doesn't get cloud computing, right? They're really not clear on what the goals are, and they really don't understand what the costs are. And which leads me to the next thing, the idea about repatriation. There's lots of statistics. One of them that we have is 80% of companies repatriated workloads from public cloud in the last 2 years. There's a lot of hope of what can be delivered through cloud, but if it's not done well, there's issues. And there's been a lot of people going backwards. Matter of fact, it's funny, the true benefits of cloud computing are things like increased efficiency, security, data storage, flexibility, scalability. All of the true benefits, in a lot of cases, that's why people were repatriating, because they were getting just the opposite, because they weren't doing things well. And if you go to the next slide, it's important as we go forward here as a group that everyone understands what we talk about when we talk about cloud costs. So obviously there's the traditional database model, right? You've got, okay, it's capital expenditure, the biggest cost associated with licensing the database software and OS, but then provisioning the infrastructure to support that. And it's not just supporting the workload, it's supporting for peak. In a lot of cases, you need to do that, especially depending on how important that database is, right? And provisioning to buffer for growth. And one of the examples here is, well, I only need 50 gigabytes, but I've provisioned 100 gigabytes because I expect growth. So there's a lot of work to be done there. This is very typical in an on-prem, in a more traditional world. Now, from a cloud perspective, it's OpEx, right? It's a subscription. I'm paying a monthly fee. And there's flexibility in provision. That's one of the benefits, right? So I'm automatically going to scale if I need more resources, and I can expect to pay as I consume CPU, memory, your IOs, storage. But then there's some other surprise costs like data egress. When I'm taking data that I brought in, I'm moving it across cloud regions. Disaster recovery, high availability. This is a couple of examples of things that have turned around and been like, oh my goodness, look at all of a sudden what my bill looks like at the end of the month. So to really do this well, I'm going to pass it back to Kevin. What he's going to do, he's going to start you down the path of what is healthy database migration or cost for the cloud. So Kevin, why don't you take it back?
Right on. And one of the things I'll point out there too about the difference between CapEx and OpEx in the previous slide when we were talking about executive management, with capital expenditures, that means that you release a procurement, a request for information to vendors. It takes a long time to collect set up the specs for what the servers you need to buy and your Windows license, Microsoft licensing, and all those kind of things. And it happens every 3 or 4 years. You amortize those costs. And even if it's a big number, executives kind of expect that. With the OpEx model, one thing we've seen with our customers is executives don't expect to see a fairly high bill every month, right? So they get a bill for $100,000 every month, and they're like, well, what is going on? This is crazy expensive. And so it's one of those things that if you work in the old mindset, you will encounter things that are either disappointing or unexpected or surprising or alarming. In the same way, if we have our developers writing lots of queries that are not tight, they use select star for everything, and they don't use enough filtering on their where clauses, and they bring back 300 megabytes of data instead of potentially the 30 megabytes of data that is only needed for that specific report or query, then we see those data egress costs go way up because you're pulling back much more data than you need to. And no one's ever thought of it before in those terms.
And then you also
So,
then you
go
also
on.
get the C-level solution, which is throw resources at a problem, right? So when you start getting those egress issues, you scale up, at which point you go from 100,000 a month to 120 or 130. Then you fix the problem. Then you realize that your vendor may not let you scale back.
Right. Or it may take a long time, or the bad habits that the developers are using just continue to suck up more resources. And as they are consumed, you have to spend.
Yeah.
Whereas on the old on-premises style, we usually buy extra headroom so that if you're a little bit sloppy in those kinds of ways, it doesn't matter so much. But in the cloud, you pay for every cycle of CPU. You pay for all of that storage, all of those IOPS. Now, this is just a quick slide to let you know that there are some well-proven paths to doing this kind of analysis. And they're for both Azure and AWS, they have what's called the well-architected framework. And they each have their own, but they're quite good. And they're very similar. They're not identical, but they take you through the best practices of that early part of planning. Maybe you need to set up a landing, what we call a landing zone, which is kind of a very large kind of test sandbox to prove out your concepts and so forth. Then as you do your work and you actually accomplish work, now you can measure and see how much it costs. You can see if your developers are learning the new practices and so forth. So put that on your list of further research later on down the line for the well-architected framework for the cloud vendor of your choice. Now, from here, once you get it in place, monitoring and observability is more important than ever because you pay for everything. So when you have poorly performing code, you need to recognize that it's now a spending issue as well as a performance issue. Whereas often on premises, it's not a spending issue. It's like, we need to get better performance. What can we do to improve that? So it's a whole different sort of philosophy, if you will. Now, I'd like to hit you up with some questions.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what the group has that we've got attending today. And obviously, you're here based on the title of this webcast. We'd like to know a little bit more about your own cloud migration plans. So I'm going to push this poll out here, okay? And basically, there's a couple of answers where we're asking you to take a shot at letting us what you think. So first of all, what are your cloud migration plans? Have you already migrated to the cloud? Now you're looking for cost optimization. Planning to migrate within the next 90 days, but you need to keep costs down. You're migrating from 90 to 180 days in the future, but you're still doing your planning. You're migrating in the future, you're just starting to learn, or other. So like, love to know. So right now I'm looking at, so far we've got a lot of folks that have already, actually most people have either already moved. Let's see if we can get some more answers here. But it looks like most of you have already migrated, but you're now looking at costs and how you optimize, which makes a lot of sense. And geez, we should have probably asked, have any of you had to deal with repatriation with your initial move?
Right.
But and feel free to throw something in chat if you have a story you want to tell. But it looks like it's either folks have either already migrated or they're in a different position. They're not in a point where they've made a decision. They're in the process of learning. But for the most part, it looks like most of you guys have migrated.
All right. Well, let's move on. Let's talk about the assessment phase. And one thing I'll just pop up a little web page for you is notice that we have a couple independent websites. And I really like both of these websites because they tell you about all the different instance classes that you can grab and use and how much they cost. So one of the things you'll do as you go through the planning phase is you'll do quite a lot of tinkering with the vendor provided ROI tools or TOC, total cost of ownership tools, and their costing tools. And so this is an independent one that will tell you, for example, on Amazon RDS, the R class of servers is typically going to be one of your most popular kind of server. So let's see here. I should be able to filter on this particular column. So an R5B, which is memory optimized, you can see what it provides for you at different levels, what its built-in networking is, and so forth. So this is another way to kind of verify the information that you're getting back from the total cost of ownership the calculators, as well as the ROI calculators from the vendors.
Yeah, and one of the things that I tell folks as well when they're moving in that direction is whatever those calculators tell you, budget at least an extra 20%, not only because the calculators can be a bit off, but because pricing models change from the time you decide you're going to do the migration till the time you're completed. And all of a sudden, half the security things that you thought were going to be included are going to cost extra. And the data rates are going to change a little bit. And it's better to have the extra 20% in your budget and not use it than to suddenly have to go back and explain why you're 20% over.
Right. And great information there too, Jeff. And one of the other things too that I find is that many people overestimate their skill. They're like, I can pick this up very quickly, and it turns out it's a little more difficult than they thought. And so a lot of the challenges with moving to the cloud are really about our people and our processes rather than the technology itself. So yeah, that's always wise to put a little pad into that as well. Now, when we're planning to deploy to the cloud, we have what we call the 6 R's. Now, this is your overall strategy. And a lot of these we are not going to investigate because they don't involve a migration. For example, we might choose to retain or keep the existing app exactly as it is. We might retire it and get rid of it. We might replace it either with a new version that we build ourselves or we go out and buy a new tool. Those are not part of our consideration today. The most common ways are to either A, rehost, which is also called lift and shift. That means I have a largely virtualized environment. I'm just going to take my VMs and put them in the cloud. That's very popular because it's a fast way to get your resources into the cloud, but it has a downside. And it's the last bullet point in that window, which is it doesn't actually give you the true benefits of the cloud, which are things like improved efficiency, flexibility, scalability. You have all the same problems you had before. Now you've just taken them to the cloud, but it does move your infrastructure and your databases, so forth, moves those quickly. The other approach, which is very common, is to re-platform on the managed services of the different vendors. So for AWS, that would be AWS RDS for SQL Server. For Azure would be Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instances. And this approach is the one that really can improve your life as a data professional or an IT professional, because those enable you to focus on doing the parts of your job that add value. You don't have to spend all your time for a week applying patches. They will take care of patching for you, security hot fixes, and other things like that. So it makes your job such that you can focus on improving outcomes for the business rather than just the foundational work, of plumbing for your computer systems. The third one I will mention is to refactor. And that's where you construct your systems to take advantage of a cloud-first approach. So in a refactor sort of situation, you might even go so far as to use things like microservices or serverless architecture, in which the server only spins up or spins down when it's asked to do specific work. Or you might choose to deploy, your SQL Server apps to a Azure SQL for Postgres, for example. And all of those open source databases have a tenth of the cost of the traditional commercial database platform. So it can be massively cost effective to work that way.
Yeah, you make a lot of really good points, Kevin. I'd like to mention, I think that the rehosting on VMs is the one that is most likely to be repatriated, and exactly because of your last bullet point, which is, well, we're not getting the benefits out of the cloud that we expected, so let's just bring it back and worry about it later.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of information on this slide, but we've got tons more to cover, so I'll go quickly here. The main point of this slide, and you see we have Azure across the top, 3 different options, A, B, and C. We have AWS at the bottom. And the main point here is if you're a very small shop and you don't do a lot of direct negotiations or directly interacting with a salesperson from Microsoft, there's a pretty good chance you don't have an enterprise agreement with a software assurance contract. So you may not get a chance to take advantage of these, but for larger companies that do, if you have that software assurance, that includes 2 things: Azure hybrid benefits, which means you can deploy to Azure using the cost schedule that you've negotiated with Microsoft, and also license mobility, which enables you to deploy, say, to any virtualized hosts at your discretion. So that could be AWS EC2 instances, it could be GCP VMs for Google, it could be Rackspace or what have you. So the main point to make here is that there's a number of different kinds of ways you can kind of negotiate your deals with Microsoft. And if you have one of those special deals, then you can use that to your advantage as you deploy to the cloud. Study that at your leisure as you have more time. In a similar way, and I know this is something, Jeff, you've helped many customers with, is kind of choosing the wrong class of, the license for the server edition of SQL Server.
Well, hopefully we're helping
Maybe
them
they're
choose the
using
right one, Kevin.
Well, many customers are choosing the wrong one, and so you come along and you'll say, well, why are you using Enterprise Edition on a server that only has 16 CPUs?
And 100 gig of memory.
Yes, exactly. In the same way, it's interesting that in Azure, there are special licenses for your non-production environments. So for dev and QA, you can get a big discount there. AWS on RDS doesn't have that. So if you want to use SQL Server Developer Edition, you can only do that on EC2. Otherwise, you'll have to use SQL Express, believe it or not, on that. So there are discounts available. Another quick note too is the DTU. Have you ever heard of DTUs?
I've heard of them.
Jeff? Yeah, well, and that's the way you want to keep it. So it's a database transaction unit. So you can purchase your Azure compute in DTUs, but it's really hard to pin down and determine if you're making the right choices there. I always recommend that you go with the option for virtual core, vCore based deployment in the cloud. Now, one other quick note here too, both the pricing and the TCO calculators for each of the vendors that we're covering today are listed there. And, what difference does it hit in your brain when you see TCO versus pricing?
Are you asking me or the audience?
I'm asking both of you guys.
Yeah, well, TCO, again, price is only one element when you're looking at the total cost of ownership. It's much bigger than just the price you pay.
Yeah.
Right. So TCO would include like, support, I guess, things like that.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I tell folks as they're moving to the cloud is don't expect to save money moving to the cloud. It may actually cost you more in the long run. Look to the other cloud benefits and make sure those are the ones that you care about as part of the move because of that TCO.
Well, the other thing too is it's not just about the cost, it's what are the benefits, right? There's advantages. If done well, the advantages, being more competitive, being able to move faster in the market, which impacts your business. That's why you're doing it. Now, I know a lot of folks it's an edict from management, and we talked about that earlier on how much do executives really understand the why and the what. But it's much bigger than just the cost of doing it. Why are you doing it in the first place, and what are the benefits to the business?
One of the things I used to do a lot when I led the database management team for one of the big four accounting firms was we would do a lot of experimentation to determine what was the best maybe hardware, what was the best design that we are considering between two different design approaches to a new application. And it was a pain because we had to acquire hardware, provision it, and then we had to make sure we had a plan in place that after we did our experiment that it would go to a good use. Whereas with the cloud, that's just one of many examples where you can just spin it up for the 2 weeks you need it and then turn it off and you're done. So things like flexibility, experimentation, and focusing on what it is that makes you effective is a really big win, as opposed to just those nickels and dimes to run a server.
Yeah.
Now, one thing too that is a big surprise for a lot of folks who deploy to the cloud, if they haven't studied and analyzed in advance, is high availability and disaster recovery. It is an expensive proposition and often a lot more expensive than what you're used to on premises. And just broadly speaking, Pete, how would you define high availability versus disaster recovery?
Well, it's funny, real quick, back in the days when I was at IBM, I used to be responsible for our data and including our disaster recovery, and that was dumping things to tape. I know I'm old, and putting them down about 20 stories below ground. God forbid there was a fire or an explosion, right? That's disaster recovery, right? Or there's a power outage or something that's causing some kind of unnatural or disaster. High availability says, especially like with financial and healthcare, where I need to make sure something's available at all times, and I need redundancy built in real time. Very different than disaster recovery.
Yeah, we have we onboarded a customer last month, as recently as last month, that said, I don't need to do backups. I have high availability set up. And what I tell new admins is that what you really need to do is find the practical joker in your group and ask the question, if you were going to mess this up, how would you do it? And show your architecture, because that practical joker is the one who's going to say, okay, you're going to have somebody's going to accidentally drop or delete a table in production. And HA is going to replicate that. And if you don't have a backup, you are simply out of luck. All right, this region gets an ice storm. You're not failing over to another Azure region. Guess what? You're simply out of luck. And it really takes a lot to do the planning for this. And you need to understand all the components in order to make it work.
Right. Now, there are entire sessions that last an hour just on doing this part right. So we can only give you a flavor of what you need to plan around. Yeah, or even a day, exactly. But there's massive amount of flexibility here. You might have low needs in terms of how quickly you need to recover. You might have very high speed needs to get things up or keep them up right away. Just like in an airplane, we have redundancy. We have two pilots. We have multiple engines, so that if one or more fail, there's one to pick up immediately. Whereas in other cases, we don't have to have that kind of availability. So just keep in mind, if you use the very best in class, which is a multi-availability zone, high availability plan, that will cost the same as double your servers or even more, maybe 2.5 times as much.
Yeah, and
go on.
well, one of the other points that I bring to technical groups is that the HA and DR solutions are not technical decisions, they're business decisions. What
That's
you
right.
need to do is ask management, how long can you afford to be down? How long can you wait for me to bring things back up in case of an absolute disaster? I've had customers that say, if I lose 2 transactions, it's devastating. Take a look at stock trades. If you miss a stock trade, you may cost somebody millions or tens of millions of dollars. At the opposite end, I had somebody say, if I lose a day's worth of data, we can reproduce it. That happened once, and I've never had it happen since. But it's a business decision before you start spending the money on HA and DR and making those decisions.
Right. So unfortunately, we don't have enough time to delve into this more. But there is one point I do want to make, which is about read replicas, because it'll show up in a moment when we talk about your hardware and provisioning. And that is that you can use read replicas not only for performance benefits by shunting off the read-only traffic to your read replica, which is cheaper than having a second active server in an active availability group. You can also use that and promote that up to your primary at times. It's just that it's a slower kind of rollover, failover than the default sorts of high availability. So there are some little tips and tricks in there like that can help you out. So let's talk about the actual server and instance class that you choose. Now, remember, you pay for your compute, you pay for the memory that you purchase, and depending on the vendor, it's kind of fixed ratios. You get this many CPUs, that means you get this much RAM. So it's not the kind of thing that is quite as flexible as you're ordering from, say, Dell or Lenovo when you buy a new server. Also, another thing that is kind of fixed according to the type of instance that you decide to acquire is your networking performance. And that's very important for things like backups. If you're doing that over the wire or moving large amounts of data over the wire and your networking throughput has a fixed kind of upper end, that can also impact. And then with your IO, you pay for everything you store, but you also pay for the kind of IOP performance, input-output performance that you get. So let's talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, can I jump?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on the storage for a minute. Storage in the cloud is probably the one place that I see most people paying a lot, not getting what they're paying for. I do a lot of performance and tuning gigs. It's one of the things that's a lot of fun for me. And I'll say you do realize that in your application, you're getting basically enterprise class storage speeds for spinning disk, not enterprise class speeds for flash or whatever your memory-based storage is. And they'll say, well, I'm paying for 80,000 IOPS. And my answer is, well, not only are you not getting it, but it's not feeding the database fast enough. So the need to look at all 4 of those is critical to make sure you're getting what you pay for, much less whether you're getting what you need.
Absolutely. A very good point. So a couple quick points that I want to make here. Again, we're already looking at 20 minutes left in our session, and we definitely have 20 minutes more content to go through. The first is when you're looking at compute, in my experience, I've seen most of my SQL servers maybe 30 to 40% CPU utilization. And in the cloud, you want to push that harder and higher. So you want to target more utilization on your instances in the cloud, 60%, 70%, or more as a day-to-day working threshold for CPU. Another thing too is that there's a couple different ways you can purchase your instances. On demand is the default. which means give me these service, this service of a particular kind of instance as I need it. But there's a cheaper way to do that, which is a reserved instance. So you pay more upfront with a reserved instance, but your overall costs are lower. And so that's a good way to save money. Also, another thing about storage optimization that I want to point two things. One is that most everybody's probably on SQL Server 2016 or later. And with SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 2, we get SQL Server data compression for free. It used to be part of Enterprise Edition. You have to pay a lot for it. I have done enormous amounts of testing on the CPU overhead of data compression, and it's extremely low, except in a certain couple edge cases. And it will save you about 60% in your IOPS and your storage consumed. So absolutely enable data compression. The second point that will save you lots of money if you have to have a high-end SQL Server instance is to enable a front-end cache. So you might use RDS, Redis. Azure has Redis as well. So those front-end caches for systems that have a lot of reads and writes will cache those reads for you, and it's like getting a massive performance boost. And they're very cheap. They're only a few $100s a month to have a front-end cache in front of your database. So that's a extremely important tip that can save you thousands per month. What about some of these other ones? Jeff, you and I have talked about things like database consolidation in the past. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to add on that?
That is one of the ways that we are. And one last point about the storage optimization. We have customers that have told me their performance has increased just because they've compressed their indexes.
Oh, yes.
Which in some ways is a surprise, but in others makes sense because that's what you're spending all of your time reading. Well, a lot of your time reading.
Yes.
We have a lot of customers. Data sprawls become crazy. I've got an hour presentation just on data sprawl. But the short version is that with SQL Server being so easy to spin up, a lot of companies have departments that have spun up SQL servers. We've got a customer that told us they had 12 SQL servers, and 2 years later, we're up to 45 and still counting because they're a small organization or small departments within their organization that have a SQL Server. They're not managing them well. They're not backing them up. They're not doing maintenance, but they've got them. So as you start looking at all the licensing costs, it becomes very important to be able to analyze and find out via tool, how big is it? How much work is it being performed? Do I have 10 servers all running at 5% of capacity? And can I combine these, or do I have a problem because of licensing agreement with third-party software vendors? So a lot of very expensive things going on where you can save hundreds or millions of dollars in licensing costs, and that's based on a direct experience. What's going on in that area?
Just a quick note too. I saw it on my slide and I thought I'd call it out. If you're open to using Linux, that's another way you can save a pretty big chunk of change compared to using a Windows OS. And although they don't preach it very much, Linux actually performs about 5 to 7% faster than Windows OS. Windows Server. There is a version of Windows called Windows Core Server that doesn't have UIs, and its performance is comparable to Linux. So that's another way you can save a few bucks too.
Yeah, and SQL Server on Linux is faster than SQL Server on Windows.
Exactly. All right. So when we talk about storage, some things to keep in mind. You get to choose different kinds of storage that you might use. There's both vendors have on the high end, they have like NVMe flash memory that looks like a hard disk. On the low end, they have hard disks, which are the slowest and admittedly not what you want to use. But then the price is based on those various types. whether you provision the IOPS in advance or not. You just use a general purpose workload sort of retention. And then how much space you consume. So in the old days on our on-premises SQL servers, a lot of times we would keep multiple copies of backups just sitting around in case we needed to roll back to last week or the week before. And that would cost us double for every additional copy of the database backup that we stored. So that's the kind of thing that you want to be careful of, because it may require rethinking how much of your, things like your backups and other kinds of ancillary data that you also keep.
Yeah, and a lot of you may end up in environments where you have regulatory reasons that you need to keep these things for a prolonged period of time. And that's a great reason to go for the cheap storage.
Right. For example, on AWS, they have S3 cold storage, Glacier cold storage. And it has some restrictions, like you're only going to call that data up once or twice a year. If you call it up frequently, then you pay more. But if you only call it up to, say, 3 or 4 times in a year, it's dirt cheap. Yeah, good point. So, Pete, do we have another poll here?
Yeah, it's funny too, because on the first poll, I jumped the gun. It took a while to get more responses, and it actually turned out that the majority of our responses were, you are evaluating moving to the cloud, but right now you're still learning, which makes this a great question. Have you studied, here, let me push the poll. Yeah, let me push it out here. Oh, okay.
Yep, let's see it.
Pushed out there. Sorry. Have you studied on-premise database health and usage patterns? So the options are here. Let's see here. No, we'd like help performing database health checks. No, we'd like help conducting our own database health checks. No, and don't spam me, which is a good option. Yes, we have tools that helps us with database health and usage patterns. And yes, we use custom scripts to assess database health and usage patterns. So is this something you need some help with, all the way to the point where, we got this, we've got scripts, and we get into it in a significant way? And the early indications, I'm going to say early because I blew it last time, looks like we've got some folks that really have their act together, and they've got ways to evaluate this process. They've got tools, and in some cases, they've got really detailed scripts to assess that. But why don't we just give everyone a couple of more moments to get some more of your answers.
And Joseph Miller just put in a comment in which he says, it's advisable to schedule downgraded resources when usage is reduced. He says, what may be direction in this area? I always like to joke that a good question is one that is about the slide you're currently on, but a great question about the slide I'm just about to go to. So that was really insightful, Joseph, because the very next slide we have addresses exactly that thought. Yeah. So what are we seeing in the poll there, Pete?
There's a variety, like I said, and for those that already have tools in place and they've got ways to assess health, you see the value of doing that. And there's some folks saying, hey, you know what, I could really use some help being able to do that, because you can see the benefits of being able to really truly assess the health of your database. So yeah, I think we have a pretty good smattering across the board here.
Yeah. And we build that into our monitoring tools, just as an aside. So yeah, so Joseph asked a question that's perfect for the next slide. One of the number 4 tenet of our 3 tenet of our 5 ways to reduce costs is to use smart automation. Okay. And so that's one of the great things about the managed service providers like RDS from AWS and Azure SQL Database managed instances, is that not only do they patch the minor versions and do that for you automatically, apply the hot fixes for security and that sort of thing, but with Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, that is, it'll even upgrade to the newest version, major version, so that you are always on whatever the latest version is. And, you know, if you're like me and you've had to do upgrades on hundreds of SQL Server instances throughout your organization, that was, you know, it was kind of like a nightmare week that everybody knew we'd be working long hours to get those servers back up so the customers, our internal customers, could use them. But these systems will take care of that for you. And so most of the vendors do provide not only that minor patch capability, some of them give you the major patching capability built right in. You don't have to worry about it anymore. But then they will also do auto scaling of resources. Now, at a minimum, most of them will auto scale storage. But in some cases, you can even say, say for Amazon EC2, Azure VMs for SQL Server, you can say if it gets CPU gets this and such high, move to a better class of instance and give me that better performance. So you can have those auto behaviors built in. And the one that Joseph was specifically asking about is what we call instance scheduling. So there's two ways to look at it. There are manual ways on AWS. You'd use Lambda functions. On Azure, you would use Azure functions and say, if workload drops to this and such level, or between these hours, we know that no one is working on the system from 9 p.m. until 6 a.m., for example. You can just shut down that service. And when that happens, you only pay for the storage, and I believe there's one other element that you pay for, the CPU perhaps, but everything else is no longer accruing costs. However, AWS RDS and Azure SQL Managed Instances also have instance scheduling built right into the tool. So that means you can say within your particular managed service, here are its working hours, and outside of those working hours, shut yourself down, don't accrue those costs, and then later on, turn it back on. So that's another smart way to take care of that. And there's cool things you can do if you want to go to the trouble of using the Azure Logic apps or Azure Functions, that sort of thing, or Lambda, and that you can have dynamic, you can have predictive, you can have machine learning driven sorts of ways to auto start and auto stop your instances. Now, this slide kind of goes to the heart of Jeff's favorite part of running SQL servers, and mine too, in all honesty, which is to improve your SQL and database design. Sloppy SQL code will suck up all the resources you give it. And if you're not a careful database designer, you will have all kinds of redundant data. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Oh gosh, I could talk about this for days, so I'll try.
Exactly. Right.
And I do. I've got a 5-day class on this. So short version, the first thing you look at is code debt, right? Because people have code they've written 20 years ago, 10 years ago, that was written for an earlier release of the server. For example, we were just tuning this week code that had, instead of the new from clause, it had the from A comma B, where instead of from A join B, right? And guess what? We got 39-minute response time down to 39 milliseconds simply by fixing the syntax. And guess what? I went through QA really fast because it didn't change the result, but it changed the optimizer's index selection. So yeah, code. It's important to find the code that's causing the problem. It's important to identify indexes. I've got code on my blog that shows how to identify duplicate indexes, how to identify unused indexes, how to identify missing indexes, how to identify indexes that aren't being used. And a lot of these you can pick out of simply query plans. There are red flags and query plans that you can pick up really quickly. But the ability to just go after all of them on a system, it's really, really flexible to take the shotgun approach rather than having to tune query by query, which is how we used to do it 20 years ago. And then once you've done the shotgun approach, then start looking at the heavy hitting queries and going, okay, Shotgun didn't work for this one. We're going to do it the hard way, the fun way.
I do have some. I have some of this content in my database migration book, but I also have it in some free webcasts that are recorded and available here on our Solarwinds website about how to tune a database design and how to tune SQL code and how to conduct a SQL code review. And it's full of scripts like this that I'm showing here. And I'm sure your content has the same kind of information and more about how to find unused indexes or unused tables and things like that. So yeah, and again, this is something you could spend a lot of time on. And for me, it's a ton of fun. This is also a big part of what our tools do. So we have 3 database observability tools at SolarWinds. We have our popular DPA, Database Performance Analyzer. And this is unique in that it uses a weight statistics approach to finding poorly performing SQL and designs and things like that on your databases. It could be SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, PostgreSQL, DB2, Oracle, the whole shooting match. Then we have Pete's product, Database Observability, and I like this one for SaaS applications. You've built it for the cloud, and you want to monitor it from the cloud. And it also covers the relational databases and quite specially some of the NoSQL databases as well. And then our third product, which is the one that I spent years of my life developing and being a part of the team, is SQL Sentry. This is Microsoft specific, very, very deep, the deepest and broadest sets of information you can get on the Microsoft data platform. And it is only for the Microsoft data platform, but the whole thing. So it covers analysis services and Azure Synapse pools. It covers on-prem SQL Server, Azure SQL, SQL Server RDS, and so forth. So those are our 3 tools that can help with all of these tuning issues, all of these sizing issues for what you want to accomplish in the cloud, and help you with migrations. So our last poll, and then I think we have probably 5 minutes more after this. So what's our last poll, Pete?
All right. So what we're looking for here is really we talked about those 3 tools and want to know if you'd like to learn more about any of our database tools. So what we have here is, are you interested in learning more about our database observability, which is our SaaS observability offering? And by the way, that's part of a unified offering that includes integration into the applications, the network, the infrastructure, logs, user experience. Database Performance Analyzer that Kevin was talking about, that is actually also an integrated part of our hybrid cloud or self-hosted and Orion offerings. And then we have SQL Sentry, and actually there's a lot of work going on to make that decision on our self-host or on-prem offerings, which is SQL Sentry and DPA, and then Database Observability is our SaaS offering. So if you'd like to learn more about any of those, just let us know.
Right. And again, DBO, I recommend that for SaaS and NoSQL situations. DPA, I really love that, especially if you have developer-heavy organizations. Maybe you don't even have a DBA. And finally, SQL Sentry is for those environments that are business critical SQL Server, and you want the very best. So they're all great in their own niche.
Yeah, and just to let you guys know, I'm looking at the responses. We have a very diverse group here because there is a lot of interest, and it's almost equal across all 3 offerings. Very powerful offerings, and of course, Jeff is a uber wizard on DPA, and Kevin is an uber wizard on SQL Sentry, and they both obviously can cover the whole waterfront. But database is so important. It's such an important part of our portfolio, and that's why we wanted to make sure we covered all the different elements. And whether you're sitting there on-prem whether you're moving to the cloud or you've got feet in both camps, which most people do. Thousands and thousands and thousands of customers are always going to be in a hybrid world. We needed to make sure we could cover that.
Right on. So the final tenet of our 5 steps to master your spending is to take advantage of the tools that are available in the vendor platforms that monitor and kind of set guardrails on your spending specifically. So for Azure, we have Azure budgets. For AWS, we have also AWS budgets, and each of them also have some additional tools. For example, on AWS, AWS has Trusted Advisor, which will look at your environment over time, use machine learning rules that have been developed internally, and say, based on what you're doing, we think you can save money by enabling this particular feature and disabling that particular feature. So each of the different vendors give you ways to, set guardrails, if you will. And there's a couple things, though, that you have to do in order for these applications to really live up to their potential. The first is that you have to reference them frequently. You have to go back and check. So if you, for example, in each of the budget tools, you can say this group of people can only spend a certain amount of money per month. This dev team can spend $3,000 per month. So you have to come back and make sure that they're staying in those boundaries, or set alarms. It will send you alarms if they get close to that frequently or exceed that. You can also set controls so that they.
The other thing, too, is that you really have to spend some time labeling and tagging all of your assets in the cloud. This is crucial.
So in my own case, I tag its, I guess you could say, the kind of environment it is, whether it's a development server, whether it's QA, testing, user acceptance, production. So I'll have a tag for each of those characteristics. I'll have a tag for whether it's a silver class of server, gold or platinum, whether it's our highest end. I'll have tags for whether it's OLTP, mixed workload, or a heavy read kind of OLAP, BI application. So I tag all of those things, and in multiple different ways, so I can spin that cube and look at it from multiple different ways to see if I have unexpected costs creeping up. If you don't tag it, it won't be able to find and attribute the characteristics of your different spending buckets to the different resources that you have that you've set up. So it's very, very effective and extremely important, but it is something that a lot of shops tend to overlook, particularly if your IT shop is the kind of place where every developer has the SA password. So you got to change your thinking before you let that go to the cloud.
Yeah.
Did either of you have a comment on that one?
Yeah. First, correlation is critical. It's not optional.
Yes.
It's correlation is critical. Second, if your development team all has the SA password, give up.
Yeah. Don't even start. You've got to change that before you move to the cloud. All right. Well, we are almost out of time. We got 1 minute left. We might go a minute or two over, but we are actually also at our last slide here as well, our last couple slides. So as we mentioned when we kicked off, love to get interaction from you, our audience. It doesn't happen as much as you might think. So people say, oh, I'm sure you're busy answering questions all the time. And, when I do webinars with hundreds of people, but usually only a couple will send a message. So that's one thing to consider. and we love your feedback. And then a quick review of a summary on the things that we presented. Decide on your cloud deployment strategy far in advance, whether it's VM centric, which makes it easy to move to the cloud, but you lose a lot of benefits of the cloud, or if you want to use a managed service centric approach. And use any licensing specialties that your company is contracted to your advantage, because you can get Azure hybrid benefits, you get licensed mobility, etc. Number two, right size for the workload. So that means you need to know your workload, and you need to know what kind of resources will match that workload, whether that is a particular instance class, a certain amount of memory, a certain kind of networking, a certain kind of storage and IOPS. Use those smart automations everywhere you can to control your spend and reduce the amount of usage, because every bit of a resource in the cloud that you use, you are charged for. Talk to Jeff and I afterwards if you want to spend more time figuring out about unused duplicate tables, poorly tuned SQL queries, all of those kinds of things. That will greatly reduce your costs if you spend some time tuning your performance. Yeah. And then finally, use those vendor budgeting tools to raise alarms, to control costs, and to correlate and attribute your into the right buckets. I'm sorry, Jeff, you had another point?
No, yeah. I just want to add, the lift and shift. If you're lifting and shifting an existing problem, you're going to have that same problem in the cloud. So you need to start your tuning exercise sooner than later. And if you're going to start a tuning exercise, I'm just going to put a feather over in Peter's hat, because if you don't have a tool, it's amateur hour. No offense to anybody, but I remember my first 10 or 15 years as a DBA, I wrote my own tools because nothing was available. And as I discovered that tools were available, you realize, A, you have teams doing things that you really can't do yourself. B, you have the ability to do a lot of slicing and dicing. C, every time a new release comes out, you don't have to go and recode things for the change system tables and contents and DMVs. And it just makes your life an awful lot easier and speeds things up. 20 years ago, if I was doing a tuning gig, I would spend a week tuning an environment. Today, I know at 10 a.m. on Monday morning, because I will send one of these tools ahead of me, and I will know exactly what's going on in the environment, exactly what it's doing, exactly where the bottlenecks are. So the tuning engagement starts on Monday morning instead of the discovery starting on Monday morning. So I very highly recommend, if you've never used one of these, or if you have a tuning tool that is sitting on the shelf and is really shelfware, pick a good one.
Right. And we see that happen all the time, where they're not happy with it, they don't use it, and it just sits on the shelf. Speaking of tools, you can see our products live if you want to play with them in our web portal against real live databases. DBO, the initial link I had was very long, so I just put a bit.ly there. Then we have DPA, and finally we have SQL Sentry. So you can play with any of those directly. If you also answered in the poll that you would like to see more information about any of these tools or all of them, we will contact you after the fact. If you mention in one of the polls that you would like help, then Jeff and his team will also respond to that to give you help with a health check and things along those lines. So with that, we didn't do too bad. We're just a few minutes over the hour here. I'm really impressed, guys. Jeff and I always joke with each other how it's not a question of whether we'll talk enough. It's a question of whether you can get us to shut up enough to.
Yeah, but
so right on. Good job, guys. We made it in time. Folks, I hope that this was useful information for you. There's a ton of content in here. So if you want the slide decks, drop me a note, kevin.kline at solarwinds.com. We'll also post this on our channel on Bright Talk, on our YouTube channel, and so forth. So please get in touch with us. We'd love to help you out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Take care.